What's up guys, Matt Laidlaw here, coming to you from LA area's oldest, largest, and finest Harley-Davidson dealership, Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson. So today I'm going to be doing another comparative video. I'm going to be comparing some of the smaller bikes that Harley-Davidson puts out. I'm going to be doing the popular Iron 883 and the Street Rod 750. So these bikes are similarly priced, and so I'm going to be doing a ride on both. I'm going to be going out with David, and so we're going to be talking about our opinion on these two bikes and how they match up and what we'd recommend as far as your riding preferences, who we recommend these different bikes to. So let's start off with a walk around these two motorcycles. So I'll kind of start off with kind of just a first glance aesthetics and looks on these two motorcycles. So first off, we got the Street Rod 750. So when I first saw the Street Rod, and this bike was just recently introduced in the 2017 model year, and this is a spin-off version of the Street 500 and Street 750, which have been out now for about 4 years. They were first introduced in the 2015 model year. But the Street Rod basically took that bike and had applied some major performance upgrades on the bike and some aesthetic changes as well. So I feel like as far as aesthetics go, the direction Harley went in with this bike is kind of a cross between a cafe racer, a dirt flat tracker, and a sport bike. You've got the bar end mirrors there, and the tail end is kind of cafe racer-esque. I feel like the seat is too a little bit, and the riding stance. I like the tail end. I don't particularly care for the plastic piece that comes off the back and has the license plate mount there, but that's all right. Overall, the aesthetics I think are pretty decent. It's got the little cowl or the little fairing in the front, little bikini fairing, whatever you want to call it, speed windscreen, which I think looks good. It's like a two-piece, almost like a step style, which is a little bit different than like the fairing that came on the Lowrider S. I feel like this one's looks a little bit nicer. So you've got dual disc brakes in the front, which is a major step up from the original OEM Streets. And you can see the intake there. It's definitely an improved intake this year, and this is the Revolution X, the high output Revolution X engine, and really what that high output signifies is they went to a different cam, a higher lift camshaft on this, and they increased the compression ratio to 12:1, and you've got a dual throat throttle body. It's up from I think a 38 millimeter up to a 43 millimeter now, and then a better intake, a little bit different exhaust as well. So some different pistons, higher compression, and different tweak on the throttle body and tune to make this thing put out about 10% more power, about 8% more torque. You got an inverted front end on this bike as well, and that does really improve the handling through turns when you're cranking on it, which is definitely noticeable. And you got better shocks on that bike as well. So let's move over to the 883 here for a second. So the Iron has kind of been an extremely good seller for Harley-Davidson now since it first came out in the 2009 model year. It's kind of had a few tweaks and reiterations over the years now with different brakes and different suspension and everything, but overall the engine's been mechanically and from an engineering standpoint relatively the same. It's the air-cooled Evolution engine. It's been out for a long time. Really reliable, bulletproof engine. So the shocks were upgraded in 2016. You can see there the shocks, they don't nearly have travel that the Roadster has on it. The iron really goes more for that slammed cruiser look where the fender is really hugging the rear tire. On the street rod, you've got a lot taller, more travel suspension where the tail end is stink bugged way above the rear tire, much like a sport bike or like a dirt bike, something like that. So you got a single disc brake in the front. Brakes aren't bad. You got a 19-inch wheel in the front here. It's a 17-inch wheel on the street rod. Again, one more thing to kind of lend towards the 883 being more of your classic style cruiser. Side-mounted license plate there. You got what Harley calls her tuck and roll solo seat on this bike. A lot of the blacked out cosmetics on here, which isn't really much different than the street rod. Both of these bikes have kind of that blacked out dark custom look to them. And so really in a nutshell, guys, both the style and the performance of the Iron 883 is more along the lines of what you'd expect from your stereotypical Harley-Davidson cruiser motorcycle. So, the suspension, you don't have as much travel in there. The engine is more of your low-end torque power delivery that you'd expect from a Harley-Davidson, whereas the street rod is more of a higher revving engine. You got to get the RPMs up. It's less of a relaxed power delivery. So if you're kind of like a throttle jockey type rider that likes to get on the gas, the street rod might be tailored more towards your riding preferences. The equipment on the street rod, everything is really geared towards performance. So, the engine puts out about 20 more horsepower than the iron. The iron's at about 50 horsepower. The street rod's at about 70. Although the iron does put out more torque than the street rod. So, again, if you want that low end torque, that comes on at a lower RPM, the iron's better for you. And if you want more of the mannerisms that you expect from a Harley-Davidson, like that rumble, that shaking engine, it's rubber mounted, then the iron's definitely more along the lines of what you're looking for. So I'm going to jump into some of the most important statistics that I know people are going to be having questions about. So I picked these two models first off because they're about the same price. They're both just a hair under $9,000. If you go Vivid Black on the street rod, you save about $300. But the Iron 883, you can't get it in Vivid Black. So if you compare a color to a color, they're a little under $9,000. So you can get ABS on both of these bikes. $750 for the street rod and $795 for the Iron 883. Security system is available for both, $395 on both of these. Jumping down a little bit here. So here's where a really big difference comes into play. So they have two completely different engines, and these bikes really are two really different bikes. But I think to just kind of someone new to the Harley-Davidson world, there's looking at these things for the first time, they may not be able to recognize just how different these bikes are, which is part of the reason why I'm doing this video, is to kind of talk about these differences a little bit. So yeah, first off, the street rod, you've got the high output Revolution X V-twin engine. So this is a water-cooled engine. This is an over square engine, which means the bore is larger than the stroke. This is a common configuration you see in racing bikes and sport bikes. They're usually typically a higher revving bike. The Iron 883 has what's called an undersquare engine, meaning that the stroke is longer than the bore is. So you got a larger stroke than bore, and that is what you typically see in your Harley-Davidsons. That it has a lot different power delivery than on an over square engine. So this is one more thing that makes the Iron 883 more of what you'd expect from a typical Harley-Davidson. It's more of the low-end torquey feel, as opposed to the higher RPM, higher revving, horsepower feel. So yeah, the Iron 883 is, again, a bike that's going to be more your stereotypical Harley-Davidson feel to it. So the Iron is the air-cooled Evolution. So liquid-cooled, which Harley-Davidson isn't typically known for their liquid-cooled bikes. They had a V-Rod for the longest time. They just barely discontinued the V-Rod in the 2018 model year. This engine is kind of what I commonly refer to as the baby V-Rod. This is a single overhead cam and 4 valves per cylinder, and they just increased the compression ratio on this street rod version. And when I say increased it over the regular street 500 and 750. And that's part of what makes it the high output revolution. Is they did a few things. They enlarged the throttle body. It's a dual throat 42 millimeter throttle body. They increased the compression ratio, so new pistons increased the compression ratio from, let's see here, from 11 to 1 to now it's 12 to 1. And they have a bigger, larger scoop intake on it, and they went to a taller cam as well, so longer duration cam, so higher compression, different tune, a little bit different exhaust as well, different intake, larger throttle body. That's what allowed Harley-Davidson to squeeze out about 10% more power and about 8% more torque out of the street rod. So this is definitely a higher performing engine than the Iron 883. So if you're a guy looking for real good pep and power out of these small CC engines, then the street rod is probably the better way to go. You can also see here, just things like the travel and the suspension is a lot greater on the street rod. You can see there's quite a bit of distance between the fender and the rear tire, which kind of gives it the profile of more like a sport bike, dirt bike type setup. The Iron 883, you've got the fender that really hugs the tire, which is more of your typical styling that you see on cruisers, and more of that lowered slammed look that a lot of cruiser riders want to go for. The Iron 883 is rubber mounted, and so you're going to have that stereotypical rumbling and real mechanical feel in an Iron 883. You feel like you're really riding like an old school motorcycle, whereas the street rod is very smooth, very balanced, and it's going to have a very refined feel to it. Some people might say that it feels like the Japanese cruisers, which it's not. This is very much a more of a refined, American-made bike, which leads me to another point. A lot of people, there's a big misconception going on right now that people think that the streets are all made, overseas. That's not the case if you buy it in the United States. All the bikes that are for sale in the United States are built right now in the Kansas City, Missouri plant. Now, bikes that you buy overseas, that's a different story. You may get those from the India plant, depending on where you live. But if you buy one in the United States, it's American made. So moving on, seat height, they're about the same, which kind of surprised me a little bit because I felt like the street rod was a little bit taller when I was sitting on it, but I guess not. I guess I was wrong. So the ground clearance, this is pretty significant. 8.1 inches for the street rod, 5.5 for the Iron 883. So, better for jumping off curbs and little urban areas and stuff like that. The wheel size, so you've got a 19-inch wheel for the Iron 883 in the front, a 17-inch wheel for the street rod, and for the rear, 17 in the rear as well. So you've got very symmetrical wheels in the street rod. You got a 16-inch wheel on the Iron in the rear. Fuel capacity is about the same. 3.5 gallons for the street rod, 3.3 for the Iron 883. Not a big difference there. So running order weight, this is a kind of a big point. So it's 40 pounds heavier on the Iron 883, which, anytime you're carrying more weight, you're going to need to make up for that in engine power, to make up for that in speed. So the street rod being a higher horsepower engine, with the lower weight, the street rod again is a higher performing bike. So if you're someone that maybe you're coming off of a sport bike or a dirt bike and you like to ride real aggressively, the street rod, you're going to be able to ride more aggressively, and the bike's going to be able to react and handle more accordingly to what you're trying to, your rider inputs, what you're trying to put into it. So let's go into the torque and the horsepower real quick. So the torque on the street rod is 47.9 foot-pounds of torque. That's achieved at 4,000 RPM. And then the Iron 883 is 53.8 foot-pounds of torque, and that's achieved at 3,750 RPM. So once again, I've said this already, but the Iron 883 is more of your low-end torque field cruiser bike, where real mellow, low RPM, plenty of power, out of the hole type of a setup. That's really the power delivery that most people have come to expect from a Harley-Davidson, and that low-end torque is what makes Harleys fun to ride. So the street rod, you have to rev it out a little bit more to access the power, so quite a bit different power delivery to it. Harley-Davidson doesn't publish horsepower. Basically, the horsepower on the street rod, you're looking at horsepower. I'll create my own column here. Horsepower on the street rod, you're looking at about 69 horsepower. And then the iron horsepower, you're looking at about 50. So the street rod has just under 20 horsepower more than the iron 883. To achieve this horsepower, I mean, you're taking it almost all the way to red line, which, by the way, the red line on these new street rods when compared to the regular street 750 and street 500 has been increased by 1,000. So what once was an 8,000 RPM red line is now a 9,000 RPM. This horsepower is achieved like really close to that 9,000 RPM red line there. You're quite a bit quicker with the street rod. Lean angle is pretty big, guys, so if you're someone that likes to go through the canyons and go quickly through the canyons, the street rod is going to be a lot more optimum for that type of riding than the iron is. You're going to start scraping quite a bit as you go quickly through the turns. But on the street rod, you got a 37.3 right lean angle and a 40-degree left lean angle. On the iron, it's 27 and 28 respectively. So lean angle isn't nearly as good, and that, really that's where the ground clearance comes into play. So significantly better, more ground clearance. I will say I feel, and I'm 6'6", guys. I have no business riding either one of these bikes, but at 6'6", I'm very scrunched on the street rod. That's because the pegs are pretty high up there. I felt more comfortable on the iron 883 because the pegs are lower, and I feel like there's more distance between the seat and the foot peg on the iron 883 than there is on the street rod. I'm definitely got the grasshopper legs on an iron 883, but even more so on the street rod. So the street rod for taller riders is very uncomfortable. I would say to be comfortable on a street rod, you got to be at least under 6 feet, maybe 5'10" or shorter on the street rod. The iron 883, you probably have to be 6 foot or under to be halfway decent as far as comfort and ergonomics on the 883. So the main purpose of me making this video is really to help out people that are maybe just getting into the Harley-Davidson world and they're trying to figure out their first Harley or maybe even their first bike. But these two bikes are similarly priced, and so I really wanted to make a video to highlight their strengths and weaknesses of both of these bikes so that you pick the right bike for your riding needs. I think a lot of people just look at both of them and just kind of blindly pick the one that they like the style of the most, when really that possibly could be a mistake, based on the type of riding you're going to be doing and the type of motorcycle experience you already have under your belt. So first off, since I'm on the iron, I'll talk a little bit about that. So the iron's strengths, and I've kind of highlighted this already, is the fact that the iron is very much what you'd expect from a Harley-Davidson. If you're buying a Harley-Davidson for that old school mechanical Harley rumble, Harley sound, Harley engineering, air-cooled 45-degree V-twin pushrod system, then the Sportster Iron 883 definitely has that over the street rod. The street rod, mechanically speaking, is not what you typically would expect from a Harley-Davidson. Also the aesthetics, just everything from the fit and finish, the manufacturing process, the way the bike looks is very much, without a question, a Harley-Davidson. And the profile of the bike, it's very much a cruiser. The way that the power is delivered, the throttle response, that's all very much Harley-Davidson. Now the 883 is a smaller displacement of the two options on Sportsters, the other one being a 1200cc. So this bike is in no way, a hot rod motorcycle. So if you're a young buck that likes to go fast and maybe get out on the freeway and do high mileage, high speeds, this is not the bike for you by any stretch of the imagination. But maybe your world is just local, around town, mostly surface streets. You can take the freeway, don't get me wrong, but it's just not a comfortable ride for a long duration. Plus at a 5-speed transmission, you are really revving this thing out to a higher RPM to keep your speed up. And this bike does get a little bit jittery and a lot of vibration at higher speeds at higher RPM. So yeah, the fit and finish, the paint, it's your as quintessential bobber as you can really get with the iron. The other thing that a lot of people buy Harleys for is the ownership experience of customizing a bike and making it your own. And that's one aspect of motorcycle ownership that Harley-Davidson hands down does better than any make motorcycle in the world, no question. This bike definitely falls into the best of the best of that category. So because this chassis and engine and fitment on the parts has been around for so long, it's basically given aftermarket companies and Harley-Davidson several decades to make a lot of different parts that fit this motorcycle. So if you're a guy that wants to tinker, then this is also a phenomenal bike for you. Whereas on the street rod, I can't really say the same. The street rod, and that this platform has only been out for about 4 years now, and because it does share a lot of the same fitment as just the regular Street 500 and Street 750, but as far as customization options and buying different parts for the street rod, your options are maybe like 5% of what's out there, both aftermarket and genuine Harley-Davidson on a Sportster. So it doesn't even compare there. If you're looking for the cosmetics aspect and the lifestyle aspect, the feel and the soul of a Harley-Davidson, then the Iron 883 hands down will beat out the street rod. I'll also talk a little bit about resale value too. Resale value on the iron is stronger than the street rod as well, and that's just kind of based by mere virtue of there being a higher demand for the iron out there. A lot of guys buy a Harley-Davidson for those aspects I just mentioned that Harley-Davidson delivers very, very well. A lot of the haters that I read in comment sections and on YouTube that I watch, they always point out performance, everything about performance. Well, I'll be the first one to tell you, when you buy a Harley-Davidson, guess what? You're buying a heavy cruiser motorcycle. There's no question as to what type of motorcycle you're buying. You're buying a cruiser. You are not buying a high-performance MotoGP motorcycle. So everybody wants to compare an Iron 883 to an R6 or something like that. You can't even compare the two. Anyways, I'll get off that rant. I've been on that rant before. So in an Iron 883, you're buying a cruiser. You're buying a little bobber cruiser to bop around town on. That's what you're buying with an 883. So let's move on to the street rod for a second. So Harley-Davidson first released the Street 500 and 750 as an entry-level bike that was going to be a bike that they used for their training courses. It is lighter, as I showed you before. Now the street rod put on a couple pounds since the regular streets, but it's at its inception it was a sub 500 pound bike, so it was about 60 pounds lighter than the Iron. And these bikes were just real easy geometry and ergonomics to them. It's a bike that can be handled relatively easy around parking lots, technical turns. It's just a very, very user-friendly bike. And so that bike came out. Sales weren't the greatest, and I think that's large in part due to the fact that people looked at it, started it up. It didn't look really like a Harley. It didn't sound very much like a Harley. And those are things that people want. People want an American engineered old school bike. And that's something that Harley-Davidson does very, very well, is they keep certain elements to the bike, like the sound, the mechanical feel of the bike, the very simplistic styling and instrumentation on the bike, but then they apply modern technology into these bikes so that you don't have to be a part-time technician to ride a Harley-Davidson, much like you had to 30, 40 years ago. You had to wrench on the bike as much as you rode the bike. But now Harley-Davidsons are just as reliable, if not more reliable, than any other manufacturer out there. So you've got the old school feel, but you've got the new school, technology. And I'm not saying that Harley-Davidson's technology is cutting edge, because it definitely isn't. If you want a cutting edge technology bike, maybe like a KTM or something like that. So, but that being said, it does have, things like your cruise or your ABS, and the Milwaukee 8 has a precision oil cooling system that basically makes the bike still look and feel like an old bike, but alleviate some of the heat that you get on an air-cooled engine. Anyways, so going back to the Street Rod here. The Street Rod is a liquid-cooled bike, which most high-performing bikes, pretty much all your sport bikes nowadays, are all liquid-cooled. And so, you really can squeeze higher RPMs out of a liquid-cooled bike. I mean, it's just a far superior cooling system than an air-cooled engine. Pretty much every car in the world is now water-cooled. So, yeah, you've got the liquid cooling going for it. And you've got, like I said earlier, you've got a over square engine. So it's got a bigger bore than it has stroke. So your RPM is a lot higher on the Street Rod. You don't have that real low, torquey, real relaxed power delivery that you have on most Harley-Davidsons. So because of that power delivery and that it's a higher RPM, most people will say, oh, this is a Japanese bike. Well, somehow, I don't know when, somehow high RPM bikes that you rev out a little bit more somehow got equated to Japanese engineering. So people equate that to being Japanese, when really it has nothing to do with Japanese anything. But the Street Rod, basically in a nutshell, is going to outperform the Iron 883 in every single respect. It will accelerate faster. It's got better roll-on speeds. It's got better brakes. You got the dual disc brakes. The suspension is far superior as well. And Harley-Davidson is always hesitant, I think, to put tall travel suspension on bikes, because it kind of turns what could be a cruiser style profile of a motorcycle and turns it into more of a aggressive sporty. Like I mentioned already in this video that the fender is way above the rear tire and everything. You see a lot of daylight between the wheel and the fender, and that definitely changes the profile and look of the wheels or the bike. But with taller travel suspension, the ride is a lot nicer. You're cornering, you can hold a higher speed through turns, and that definitely is the case with the Street Rod. You can go through turns better, especially with the inverted front end. The front wheel tracks a lot better, especially when you hit uneven road and debris on the road. The wheels and tires still track real well on the ground, and that's really a big job of the suspension. And something I think people overlook is how well does your suspension keep your two tires in contact with the pavement, regardless of the road conditions. So the Street Rod definitely does that better. So it brakes better, the suspension's better, it handles better, it accelerates better, and so it just basically does everything relating to performance better than the Iron 883. But it doesn't have some of those intangibles and more of that emotional pride of ownership element that the Iron has. That is, what makes ownership of a Harley-Davidson, a really cool, all-around, rich experience. And that's something else I'll touch on real quick is, on paper, a lot of people will, that haven't ridden Harleys or haven't ridden all the bikes. They'll look at things on paper and they'll say, okay, well, this bike has XYZ equipment, it's got this horsepower, and it's got this technology that sounds real cool. But there's more to motorcycle ownership than just what looks good on paper. And Harley-Davidson, it has a lot of that stuff that doesn't necessarily show up on the stat sheet. That is a really cool part of motorcycle ownership. Anyways, I'm getting too mushy, touchy-feely here. But really, that's something that I think separates these two bikes in a big way, kind of that intangible stuff that I've mentioned. So yeah, anyways, there you have it. So if I was able to help you guys out on this video, give me a big thumbs up, like the video. And I want to throw out there too, the Born Free show, huge show coming up, but we have the Born Free Stampede coming up here on Thursday, June 21st. We've got 10 tickets to give out. If you want to come see me on that day here at Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson, June 21st, that Thursday, I will hook you up with tickets and keep hooking people up until I run out. And then I will be taking over, and some of the guys here will be riding from the dealership at 7 o'clock and heading over to the Industry Hills Expo to check out the Born Free Stampede event. They got a lot of cool vintage stuff. The Harley Hooligans guys are racing, so it'll be a lot of fun. Come check it out. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you haven't already, also subscribe and feel free to leave any questions you might have in the comment section below. Take care.